It was tucked away in the corner of a musty attic, leaning against a pile of forgotten trunks. The frame was cracked, the varnish yellowed, and the canvas carried the faint scent of mildew and time, but the painting itself demanded attention. A young couple from 1895 posed stiffly, her dress a cascade of lace, his suit pristine and somber. On first glance, it seemed like any other portrait from that era, until the eyes of the observer drifted to her hand. It rested lightly on the arm of her chair, pale and delicate, but something about it felt wrong. A subtle gleam traced the curve of her fingers, like a symbol pressed into her skin, almost invisible unless examined closely. There was an unnatural stillness in the gesture, as if the hand weren't merely posed, but waiting. A pulse of unease coursed through anyone who lingered too long on it, a quiet whisper at the edge of perception that the hand was hiding something alive. Those who had stumbled upon the portrait before whispered of nightmares where shadows crawled across the room, and of cold fingers brushing their own hands in the dead of night. The more one looked, the more the hand seemed to demand attention, as if it held a secret centuries old, one that refused to remain buried. And as the observer leaned in, heart hammering, a faint shiver ran up their spine, and they understood that some things captured in a photograph or painting were never meant to be seen, not fully, not ever. The moment the door creaked open, a thick, musty scent of forgotten years washed over her, mingling with the faint sweetness of aged wood and decaying paper. The attic was a labyrinth of memories, stacked haphazardly with trunks, crates, and dust-laden furniture, each piece whispering stories long abandoned. Sunlight filtered weakly through a grimy window, casting long, uneven streaks across the floorboards that groaned beneath her careful steps. Her curiosity had driven her here, drawn by the rumors surrounding the old Hawthorne estate, a place abandoned for decades yet said to be full of secrets, relics of lives long gone. She had been warned that the house itself seemed to resist intrusions, that visitors often left with more questions than answers, and yet, nothing could have prepared her for the weight of history pressed into this attic, the silence that felt almost tangible, almost sentient, pressing down like a living thing. She moved carefully, her fingers brushing along a trunk lid coated in dust so thick it felt like powdered frost. Each surface seemed to hum with a faint vibration, a subtle reminder that these objects had been witnesses to events no one alive now could recount. Papers yellowed with age spilled from boxes, brittle and curling at the edges, some scrawled with faded ink that hinted at stories never meant to be found. She inhaled sharply as she pulled back a heavy curtain that obscured one corner of the room, revealing the outline of a frame leaning against the wall. It was larger than she had expected, its edges ornate with carvings worn smooth over time. There was a heaviness to it, not in pounds but in presence, as if it carried the weight of generations on its wooden shoulders. The portrait itself was almost hidden beneath a threadbare cloth, yellowed like old parchment, which she lifted hesitantly. As the fabric fell away, a shiver ran down her spine. There they were, a young couple, frozen in time, their expressions formal, almost stiff, yet there was a subtle intimacy in the way they stood close, his hand resting near hers delicately touching the arm of a chair. The painting was exquisite, each brushstroke meticulous, capturing the subtle curves of their faces and the delicate texture of her lace dress with unnerving precision. Yet something about the image unsettled her, a tiny flicker of unease that set her heart racing despite the serene scene. She knelt closer, brushing a finger along the frame, disturbing decades of dust. The frame itself bore the patina of neglect, tiny cracks running along its edges like veins on a withered hand. The canvas had yellowed with age, and in the dim light of the attic, it seemed almost to glow faintly, an ethereal halo surrounding the figures. The man's eyes were dark, solemn, almost imperious, while the woman's gaze seemed to follow her, calm yet unnervingly knowing. She swallowed hard, aware of the quiet in the room, the almost sacred stillness that enveloped her like a shroud. For a moment, it felt as if the past had exhaled and the air itself held its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Her fingers trembled slightly as they traced the painted surface, marveling at the detail. The lace on her dress was rendered with painstaking care, every fold and shadow suggesting movement frozen in time. The man's suit, crisp and formal, betrayed a prideful stiffness, a conscious awareness of how history would remember him. But it was her hand that captured her attention most, a pale, delicate thing resting lightly on the arm of her chair. At first, she thought it unremarkable, simply part of the formal pose. But the more she looked, the more she realized that it carried a weight of its own, a subtle tension that felt alive beneath the paint, a secret encoded in the curve of her fingers and the tilt of her wrist. She stepped back slightly, squinting as the dim light shifted across the canvas, trying to shake the sense of something watching her. The attic seemed to pulse around her, the shadows of the trunks and furniture stretching and twisting like living things. She had studied countless portraits in her life, catalogued hundreds of faces from long-dead families, but never had one seem to breathe beneath her gaze. This portrait was different. It had been waiting. Perhaps for her, perhaps for someone like her, drawn to uncover what should have remained hidden. The silence pressed in closer, and she realized that she had been holding her breath, that the attic itself seemed aware of her presence, the air heavy with anticipation. She examined the rest of the painting, searching for something that might explain the unease curling in her stomach. The background was muted, a simple interior, but the shadows were peculiar, not entirely consistent with the light source, almost as if the painter had inserted subtle hints of something unseen. She shivered, feeling an almost imperceptible breeze brush against the back of her neck, though no window was open. Her rational mind tried to attribute it to imagination, to the musty air and the isolation of the attic, yet instinct screamed that this was more than a simple painting. There was an intelligence here, a memory embedded in the canvas, a story waiting to be recognized. Her pulse quickened as she crouched again, examining the hand more closely, noting its slight irregularity in tone, the strange shimmer in the paint that shifted subtly under her gaze. It was a small detail, easily missed, but once noticed, it refused to be ignored. She could almost imagine a pulse beneath the skin, a heartbeat trapped in paint, a quiet insistence that something was not as it seemed. The more she looked, the more she felt a faint hum in the air, a vibration that resonated with her own heartbeat, linking her to a moment long past, a secret long held. The attic no longer felt merely dusty or abandoned, it felt alive, a conduit for history and memory and something darker still, the past pressing forward through the fragile barrier of oil and canvas. Hours could have passed or only minutes. She did not know. The world outside the attic seemed to fade, leaving only her, the painting, and the faint, insistent pull of curiosity that refused to release her. She realized, with a thrill of apprehension, that the discovery was not just of a portrait but of a door, a key to something hidden within the folds of time, something that demanded to be acknowledged. Every fiber of the canvas seemed to hum with quiet expectation, every shadow in the room hinting at stories that could not be spoken aloud, mysteries encoded in brushstrokes and the subtle pressure of a hand resting lightly on a chair. Her eyes kept returning to the hand, drawn by a compulsion she did not understand, a magnetic insistence that made her forget the rest of the painting and even the dusty attic around her. At first, it seemed only the delicate curve of the fingers, pale against the lace of her dress, that caught her attention, but the longer she stared, the more she noticed something unusual, something that made the hair on her neck rise. There was a ring, or perhaps not a ring, but a shape in the paint that glimmered faintly under the weak light of the attic window. It wasn't obvious, not at first. It required patience and focus, a slow, deliberate examination, and when she finally saw it clearly, a chill ran down her spine. The symbol was unlike anything she had encountered in her studies of Victorian fashion or family heirlooms. It was intricate, almost geometric, but with a fluidity that suggested movement, as though it had been pressed into her skin and had not yet faded. It did not belong to any known tradition, any catalogue design from the period. It seemed foreign, ancient, and dangerous. She leaned in closer, squinting as the light caught the surface of the oil paint in strange ways, emphasizing shadows she hadn't noticed before. The symbol seemed to shimmer faintly, not like a reflection of sunlight, but almost as if it had a life of its own beneath the paint. She blinked rapidly, convincing herself it was a trick of the eye, a combination of age, varnish, and dust. Yet the sense of unease would not be shaken. Her stomach tightened, her pulse quickened, and she became aware of a faint prickling at the nape of her neck, as though unseen eyes were observing her from behind the canvas. The hand seemed to pulse in some imperceptible way, the symbol on the ring, or in the skin itself, catching the light differently each time she shifted her gaze, reminding her that the painting was not merely a record of a moment but a vessel containing something deliberate, something waiting. She remembered the stories she had read in old journals, accounts of objects cursed or imbued with a presence, the way the chroniclers described shadows stretching differently, air thickening, and whispers at the edge of hearing. Her rational mind tried to dismiss the thought, but instinct screamed that the detail on her hand was no mere artistic flourish. She crouched closer, her nose almost touching the canvas, and studied the symbol in a careful, almost clinical manner, documenting it in her mind. It was composed of looping lines, intertwined in ways that seemed impossible, and at certain angles, it almost resembled a tiny, coiled creature, frozen mid-motion. There was a geometry to it that should not have existed, a pattern that violated the ordinary symmetry of human ornamentation. She traced it with her eyes, imagining her finger following the curve, half expecting it to recoil or shift under her touch. The more she observed, the more she became aware of a subtle, almost imperceptible hum in the air, as if the attic itself had entered a different resonance, one keyed to the presence of that hand. She shivered despite herself and pulled back slightly, suddenly conscious of how silent the house had become. The usual creaks of old wood, the distant tapping of a loose shutter, even the sound of her own breathing, all of it had faded, leaving a void filled only by the faint insistence of the hand. She could swear the symbol had moved, just slightly, a fraction of a millimeter, but when she leaned in again, it was perfectly still. Her mind screamed that it had not moved, that she had imagined it, yet the gnawing suspicion remained. Her imagination began to spiral, weaving possibilities she wished she could dismiss. Could the bride have belonged to some secret society, some clandestine order whose symbols were hidden in plain sight? Or was it darker than that, an invocation, a mark of protection, or a warning? The idea made her stomach churn. She remembered old occult texts she had once skimmed, symbols meant to bind or summon, the way a simple mark could carry power if one knew how to read it. She felt suddenly exposed, as though by observing it so closely, she had invited the past into her own space. She reached for her notebook, hands trembling, and began sketching the symbol, trying to capture its strange complexity. Each line she copied seemed to resist the pen, curving and twisting in ways she did not intend, and yet when she looked back at the painting, it appeared exactly as it had before, serene and undisturbed. The incongruity terrified her. The symbol was precise on the canvas but rebelled on paper, as if it were alive, aware of being copied, aware of being watched. She felt a cold sweat bead on her forehead, her mind racing as she considered the implications. Whoever had painted this portrait, or whoever had allowed this hand to be captured in such detail, had encoded a secret, a message that had survived the centuries. As she studied it further, other small anomalies began to emerge. The shadows of her fingers seemed slightly off, bending unnaturally toward the symbol, as if acknowledging it. The paint itself had a subtle texture, faint ridges that caught the light differently from the surrounding skin, making the symbol appear almost carved rather than painted. She ran a fingertip along the canvas, careful not to touch the paint, and felt the surface thrum lightly beneath her skin, a vibration so faint it could be mistaken for imagination, yet it left her hand tingling with the residue of it. She stepped back again, heart hammering, suddenly aware of how little she truly understood about this object. The more she stared, the more the rest of the portrait seemed to fade. The man's stern face, the intricate lace of her dress, even the muted background, all became secondary to the enigma of that hand. Every instinct in her body screamed to flee, yet fascination rooted her in place. The symbol seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm, a beat that echoed faintly in her ears, resonating with her own heartbeat. She could almost feel it whispering to her, a quiet insistence that she was meant to notice, meant to decipher, meant to be implicated in a story that had begun long before she was born. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, before she realized how long she had been there, lost in the study of a single hand. The air in the attic had grown colder, the shadows longer, as if the very room acknowledged the shift that had taken place. It was no longer just a painting of a couple from 1895, it had become a living puzzle, a nexus of mystery that refused to release its hold. She felt a shiver of recognition, a terrifying awareness that some things in the past are not meant to be understood, and yet they have a way of finding the curious, of drawing them in, of demanding that they look more closely, longer, until the boundaries between observer and observed blur. And still, the hand remained there, pale and delicate, the symbol etched into it glowing faintly in the dim light, a whisper of something that had endured beyond time, waiting for eyes willing, or foolish, enough to see it. From the moment she first noticed the strange symbol on the bride's hand, an unshakable sense of unease had lodged itself deep in her chest, a quiet pressure that refused to leave. She had intended only to examine the portrait, to catalogue its age, its brushwork, its provenance, but now she found herself thinking of little else. The attic, with its stale air and piles of forgotten belongings, felt less like a storage space and more like the threshold to something ancient and deliberate. That night, she returned home, carrying the weight of the portrait in her mind, if not in her arms, and she began to notice the first hints of the haunting connection. It was subtle at first, the sort of thing one might dismiss as imagination, a cold spot at the edge of a room, the sensation of being watched, a faint creak on a floorboard when no one else was present. She chalked it up to nerves, to the isolation of the old estate she had visited, yet the sense of something following her, unseen and patient, persisted. Dreams became impossible to avoid. They began subtly, fragments of images slipping into her sleep, the hand, pale and delicate, stretched toward her through a foggy darkness, a whisper, soft and unintelligible, just at the edge of hearing, shadows that moved with impossible coordination, disappearing when she tried to focus. Each morning she awoke with the memory of the hand vivid in her mind, the symbol etched into it glowing faintly behind her closed eyelids. She tried to ignore it, but the connection deepened, as if the painting were reaching beyond its frame, linking her to something she could not yet comprehend. In the following days, she began to research. The couple in the portrait, she discovered, were minor gentry, largely forgotten outside the small village where they had lived. Records of their lives were sparse, yet she unearthed disturbing hints, neighbors who recalled the bride as peculiar and distant, servants who mentioned strange rituals in the house late at night, whispers of people who vanished without explanation. The more she learned, the more she realized that the symbol on her hand was not decorative, it was a mark, a signature of something dark. She found references in old diaries to a mark of passage, a sigil associated with clandestine ceremonies designed to preserve the presence of the soul, or perhaps to anchor it beyond death. A shiver ran down her spine as she recognized the connection. The hand was not simply painted, it was a record, a tether, a bridge between the living and something else. The haunting grew more intense. Objects in her own apartment began to behave strangely. Books toppled from shelves without explanation, doors creaked open when she was alone, and once, in the middle of a quiet afternoon, she heard the faint scuff of shoes across her hardwood floor. She tried to reason it away, attributing the disturbances to her imagination, to the creaks of an old building, but the feeling that the hand watched her persisted, an almost tactile awareness, as if she could sense the brush of fingers along her own skin. One evening, she woke to find the lights flickering violently, the shadows in her room stretching unnaturally, converging around the empty chair in the corner where she had placed the painting. She realized with growing horror that the connection was not just symbolic, it was active. The moment she had recognized the detail in the portrait, something had recognized her in return, and it was reaching. She reached out to colleagues and other historians, trying to share the discovery, but they dismissed her concerns. The symbol, they said, was likely just a decorative flourish, perhaps a ring or a brooch misinterpreted by time and decay. But even they could not deny the intensity with which she described the painting's effect, the way the hand seemed to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, when viewed from different angles, and the way shadows in the room seemed to respond to her gaze. Each time she spoke of it, the connection tightened, an invisible thread pulling her attention back to the hand, back to the symbol, back to the secret encoded within the canvas. Then the dreams began in earnest. They became more vivid, more tangible. She would awaken in a sweat, convinced she had felt the brush of fingers against her arm, heard the rustle of fabric as if someone invisible had adjusted their clothing, felt the cold bite of breath against her neck. The hand from the painting appeared in each dream, always extended, always beckoning, its symbol glowing faintly, a soft pulse in rhythm with the dread that filled her chest. Sometimes, the dreams were almost comforting, a gentle insistence that she was seen and acknowledged, but always, beneath that quiet touch, there was a sense of expectation, a demand, as if the hand required her attention to remain anchored in the waking world. She began to notice others had experienced similar phenomena. In a local historical archive, she found a brief note mentioning previous owners of the portrait. One had sold it after claiming it watched them at night, another had suffered an inexplicable illness, and a third had disappeared entirely, leaving no trace. The coincidences were chilling, too precise to dismiss as mere superstition. Each incident connected subtly back to the hand, to the symbol, to the unbroken gaze of the bride from her frame. The portrait was more than art, it was a vessel, a beacon for something that endured, something that waited for recognition, something that demanded witness. As the days passed, she became obsessed. She could not stop thinking about the hand, could not stop tracing its lines with her mind, replaying the faint shimmer of the symbol in every corner of her vision. Every shadow, every subtle shift in light, every unexplained sound became evidence of its presence, a sign that the connection she had discovered was no coincidence. Her friends began to notice the change in her demeanor, the hollowing of her eyes, the nervous flinches at slight movements, and when she tried to explain, her words came out in fragmented, fevered bursts, failing to capture the strange pull she felt. The hand had reached beyond its frame, had become something that could not be ignored, something that marked her, subtly but irrevocably, as a participant in its story. Even in daylight, in the bustling normalcy of the world outside, she felt it. Passing by reflections in windows, she thought she saw the hand, not painted, not behind glass, but pressing against some invisible surface, reaching out. At night, the dreams became louder, the whispers forming words she could not quite understand, the pulse of the symbol synchronized with her own heartbeat, a rhythm that both frightened and fascinated her. She realized with a growing, unshakable terror that she had not simply discovered a portrait, she had triggered a connection, a haunting link that transcended time, binding her to the bride's hand, to the symbol, and to whatever force had been preserved within the brushstrokes of that old canvas. The more she delved into the story of the young couple, the more the past seemed to unravel around her, revealing threads of darkness that had long been buried beneath the surface of history. At first, the bride and groom appeared to be ordinary figures of 1895, a genteel pair living out their lives in a quiet village, attended by servants and noted occasionally in local records for their social appearances and charity work. Yet as she probed deeper, she found subtle hints in the archives, whispered mentions, almost passing, in letters and diaries that suggested the couple was not as ordinary as they seemed. A servant who had fled the estate decades earlier had described the bride as strange and cold, her hands never idle, always tracing patterns in the air as if she were speaking to someone invisible. There were references to gatherings that no one recorded officially, people arriving at odd hours, rituals that took place in the dead of night with no witnesses willing to speak of them. It was a puzzle of fragments, but together they hinted at a hidden life, one carefully concealed behind polite smiles and formal portraits. The bride, she discovered, had been rumored to practice rituals that skirted the edge of the forbidden, traditions that had been passed down secretly through a lineage no one dared to document. The symbol on her hand, she realized with a shiver, was not merely decorative, it was a mark of knowledge, a sigil of initiation, the kind that tethered a person to powers and secrets not meant for the ordinary world. Letters hinted at contracts with figures unknown, bargains struck in shadowed rooms lit only by candlelight, promises made in whispers and bound with ink and blood. The more she uncovered, the more she felt the weight of it pressing against her own consciousness, as though the veil of time had grown thin and the echoes of the bride's choices were reaching forward, insistent, inescapable. She pored over old newspapers and court records, finding curious mentions of unexplained misfortunes tied to the family. Children disappeared without explanation, livestock was found dead in unusual patterns, and servants spoke in hushed tones of strange lights flickering in the windows at night. Each mention was brief, often dismissed as coincidence or rumor, but when viewed together, a terrifying pattern emerged. The bride's hand, always poised so deliberately in her portrait, seemed to be a key, a signifier of something that had endured, a symbol of her hidden knowledge and the power she wielded through it. The historian realized with growing dread that the past was not merely past, it lingered, a presence that had been encoded into the painting itself, waiting for someone perceptive enough to notice, brave enough, or foolish enough, to confront it. She returned to the portrait repeatedly, now examining it not only for artistic detail but for evidence of this concealed history. Shadows along the folds of her dress seemed to conceal forms, almost like echoes of figures who had once stood there. The symbol on her hand glimmered faintly when caught at certain angles, an enigmatic beacon pointing to secrets that refused to be spoken aloud. The more she studied it, the more she understood that the painting was not passive, it was active in a subtle, insidious way. The bride had encoded her knowledge, her connections, her rituals into it, a hidden language that transcended the limits of ordinary perception. The painting became a map, and her hand the compass, pointing toward truths long obscured by the polite veneer of history. Her nights grew restless as she attempted to piece together the bride's life. She uncovered letters and journals tucked away in forgotten archives, their fragile pages yellowed and brittle, filled with careful, almost obsessive notations of celestial alignments, herbal concoctions, and meditative gestures. The bride's life had been governed by a pursuit of knowledge that was considered dangerous, her fascination with unseen forces and hidden energies recorded in careful detail, yet always framed within a cloak of propriety. Each discovery sent a shiver through her, for it became clear that the hand in the portrait had not simply been poised for aesthetic reasons, it had been positioned deliberately, to signify authority, to mark a conduit through which influence passed, perhaps even to protect a secret that could not be allowed to die. The historian began to feel a personal connection to the bride's hidden past, a sense that the chain of events that had begun more than a century earlier had threaded itself into her own life. She found herself retracing the bride's steps, visiting the small village, the crumbling estate, the chapel where the couple had married. The air seemed thicker here, the shadows longer and more deliberate, as though the past still lingered in physical form, imprinted on the stones, the floorboards, the very walls. Villagers spoke hesitantly of the family, their eyes widening at the mention of the bride's name. Some spoke of the curse of her hand, others avoided the subject entirely, offering only nervous smiles and abrupt departures. The historian felt a growing awareness that she was treading on ground that had not been disturbed in decades, a layer of history that had been deliberately concealed because it was dangerous, because the knowledge the bride had possessed was too potent to be left unchecked. At night, her dreams grew darker. She saw the bride performing rituals by candlelight, her hand moving in complex patterns, her voice whispering words that vibrated through the air like a subtle music meant only for her. Figures emerged from shadow, bowing or kneeling, their faces indistinct yet filled with urgency. The historian would awaken in a sweat, the symbol burned into her mind, a faint glow in her closed eyelids, and a profound sense that the hand in the portrait had reached forward, insisting that the past be recognized, that its secrets be acknowledged, and that the story of the hidden life of this young woman could not remain silent any longer. Every new detail she uncovered tied back to that hand, the delicate positioning in the portrait, the way it had been immortalized with painstaking precision. The bride's hidden past was not simply a curiosity, it was the foundation of the haunting presence she had felt since first seeing the painting. And as the historian pieced together the fragments of this life, letters, diaries, rumors, and the subtle but undeniable patterns of misfortune, she began to understand that the hand had been meant as both a key and a warning, a silent testament to a power that endured beyond the limits of ordinary life. The first night the threat became undeniable. She was alone in her apartment, the portrait leaning against the wall as though it had never left her attic. She had carried it home despite every instinct screaming to leave it behind, drawn by the same curiosity that had gripped her when she first uncovered the hidden symbol on the bride's hand. The air in the room seemed heavier than usual, thick with a quiet pressure that settled on her shoulders like a weight. Shadows pooled in corners where light had no business lingering, stretching unnaturally along walls and across furniture. At first, she convinced herself it was a trick of the lamp, a distortion caused by the uneven glow of the single bulb, yet she could not shake the sense that something was moving, shifting with deliberate awareness just beyond her vision. She paced the room, trying to banish the unease, but the symbol on the bride's hand seemed to pulse faintly, as though aware of her attention. Each time she glanced at it, the hand appeared to shift subtly, the fingers curling in imperceptible motions, as if it was stretching, awakening, or even beckoning. The sense of being watched became tangible, prickling along her skin, crawling beneath her clothes, settling into the hollow of her spine. She tried to speak aloud, calling out to herself to maintain reason, but the sound of her voice seemed to dissipate into the shadows, swallowed before it could anchor itself in reality. Her pulse hammered in her ears, synchronized with a rhythm she could not identify, a quiet insistence that something had been stirred and was now observing her every move. Then the disturbances began in earnest. Objects she had left untouched hours before shifted positions. A chair that had been pressed into the corner now faced the center of the room. A lamp tilted slightly toward the portrait, its light highlighting the bride's hand as though it had been arranged intentionally. She felt the air cool abruptly, her breath condensing in the faint glow of the bulb. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but the pattern became undeniable. Each movement in the room seemed connected to her presence, each shift in shadow timed to her gaze. The symbol on the bride's hand was no longer merely a detail, it was a signal, a conduit through which something unseen exerted influence. Sleep became impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, the hand appeared, floating in darkness, the symbol glowing faintly like an ember in a dying fire. Fingers moved with a life of their own, tracing gestures she could not understand, beckoning her toward action she could not resist. She tried to look away, tried to focus on mundane objects, but the pull of the painting was relentless. It felt as though the hand was measuring her, testing her, waiting for a lapse in vigilance, a moment of weakness that would allow it to reach beyond the frame entirely. She began to feel her own hands tingle in resonance with the painting, as if the lines of her skin echoed those on the canvas, a silent acknowledgement that she had become entwined in the bride's legacy. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the phenomenon escalated. Rain pounded against the windows in heavy sheets, wind rattling the panes, and thunder shook the building's foundation. She was seated on the floor, notebook open, trying to document the symbol's details, when she saw it, the hand, unmistakably shifting. Its fingers bent more fully now, curling as if to grasp something that did not exist in the physical world. She could not move, frozen in terror as the shadows along the walls deepened unnaturally, pooling toward the portrait like a tide, pressing the light back until the hand was the only visible detail, glowing faintly, insistent. The room seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling with a rhythm that matched her racing pulse. It was no longer observation, the hand was acting, reaching, asserting presence, and she understood with a shock that her proximity alone had activated it. The pattern of hauntings became impossible to ignore. Mirrors reflected not her own face but the hand, slightly extended, fingers curling as if warning her to step closer, to acknowledge something she could not name. Every night, the whispers began, faint, almost imperceptible at first, rising in tone, forming syllables she could not parse, yet carrying meaning she felt in the marrow of her bones. The hair on her arms rose, the skin along her neck prickled, and she realized that the bride's hand, captured for eternity on canvas, had become a bridge between two worlds. The past was no longer distant, it was immediate, pressing against her, testing the boundaries of her mind and body, demanding attention and recognition. Her research became frantic, obsessive. She combed archives for any reference to other victims, anyone who had encountered the portrait and survived. The stories were terrifyingly consistent: disturbances, sudden illnesses, hallucinations, even disappearances. She read of a previous owner who had woken to find his furniture rearranged, shadows pressing against his walls, and the subtle movement of a hand in the frame that he swore had been static the night before. She read of another who fell into a fevered delirium after focusing too long on the symbol, his dreams invaded by the extended fingers of the bride, whispering words in a language that was not entirely human. The connections were too precise, too patent to dismiss. The hand had a power that transcended paint and canvas, a deliberate reach into the world of the living. One night, she realized that ignoring the hand, turning her back to it, or attempting to retreat into rational thought only amplified the threat. The painting's presence grew stronger in her absence, the symbol on the hand pulsing like a heartbeat, the air thickening, the shadows stretching, the temperature dropping. It demanded acknowledgement, demanded a response, and each hesitation, each refusal to fully engage, seemed to strengthen its grip. She felt herself slipping into a rhythm dictated by the hand, the pulse of the symbol synchronizing with her own heart, a silent compulsion that was both terrifying and irresistible. She began to notice physical effects. Her fingertips tingled continuously, the hair on her arms rose at the faintest brush of air, and occasionally she would awaken with faint impressions on her skin, as if something had pressed against her while she slept. The hand, delicate and pale, now seemed less like paint and more like flesh, alive in some subtle way, asserting its presence. Her waking life and the world within the painting blurred, and she understood that her interaction with the portrait was no longer passive. She had triggered something, activated a force that had been dormant for over a century, and now it required engagement, demanded recognition, or perhaps even compliance with the secrets it had preserved. The immediate threat was clear: the hand would not remain contained within the frame. It had crossed a threshold, and each night, each moment she lingered near the portrait, brought her closer to the edge of something she could not anticipate, something she could not control, yet something she could not avoid. The hand's fingers curled toward her with subtle insistence, shadows crept closer, and the symbol pulsed in quiet rhythm with the terror that had begun to consume her. She realized, with a cold certainty, that this was no longer an academic curiosity, no longer a simple historical investigation. She had awakened a force, and that force was patient, intelligent, and now aware of her presence in a way that promised consequences beyond comprehension.